Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. The Serendipity of Silence. Rain drizzled over the cobblestone streets of Montreal, the glistening surface reflecting the warm amber of streetlights. In the midst of it all, Claire Langston, a violinist whose music was said to conjure stars even on cloudy nights, sat in her usual corner at Café Reverie. Her violin case rested beside her chair, still damp from the sudden downpour. She gazed out the window, absent-mindedly tracing the condensation on the glass. It was her sanctuary, a place where she came to blend into the background. Tonight, however, felt different, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. As Claire took a sip of her now tepid latte, the cafe door swung open, and in walked a man who seemed as much a part of the city's charm as its winding alleyways and hidden jazz bars. He was soaked to the bone, his umbrella uselessly dangling from his hand, but he didn't seem to care. "Rain or shine," he muttered to the barista, a mischievous grin playing on his lips as he ordered a black coffee. Claire's eyes lingered on him. Her curiosity piqued. There was something unguarded about him, a contrast to the polished patrons who usually frequented the cafe. His hair, dark and dripping, framed a face that was neither conventionally handsome nor forgettable, but rather alive with stories untold. He caught her glance and held it, his grin softening into something quieter. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, motioning to the chair opposite hers. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Thanks. I promise I won't talk too much," he said as he shrugged off his coat, revealing a faded graphic tee and a pair of glasses perched crookedly on his nose. For someone so outwardly unkempt, he carried himself with an air of confidence that was disarming. "I'm Theo," he said, offering a hand. "Claire," she replied, shaking it. His grip was firm, warm despite the rain. Silence fell between them as Theo unwrapped a leather-bound notebook and began to write. Occasionally, he would glance up as if drawing inspiration from the world around him. Claire, meanwhile, found herself intrigued by his presence, the way he seemed to pull the rhythm of the room into his orbit without trying. Finally, her curiosity got the better of her. "What are you writing?" she asked. "A letter," he replied without looking up. "To whom?" "To the future," he said cryptically, before finally meeting her gaze. "But I think it's about to change." Before Claire could ask what he meant, Theo stood abruptly. "Walk with me?" The question was so unexpected that she almost refused. Almost. Something about his earnestness made her nod, and moments later they were out in the rain. The streets had quieted, save for the occasional splash of a car passing by. Theo led her down an unfamiliar alley, its walls covered in layers of graffiti and posters peeling at the edges. He stopped in front of a large mural depicting a girl releasing a lantern into a starry sky. "This," he said, gesturing to the artwork, "is why I came to Montreal. She reminds me of you." Claire blinked, confused. "You don't even know me." "Don't I?" he asked, his expression unreadable. She opened her mouth to protest, but found herself staring into his eyes instead. They were impossibly deep, like the kind of music that lingers long after the last note has played. And then he smiled again, that same mischievous grin from earlier, and said, "Goodbye, Claire." Before she could respond, Theo turned and walked away, vanishing around the corner. Claire stood there, the rain soaking through her clothes, her mind racing with questions. Who was Theo? Why had he sought her out? It wasn't until she returned to the cafe that she noticed the folded piece of paper tucked beneath her violin case. Opening it with trembling fingers, she read the words scrawled in a hurried, looping script. "You'll understand someday. But for now, remember this. Some stories begin with an ending." Claire didn't know what shocked her more, the cryptic message or the unmistakable fact that the ink was smudged, not by the rain but by time. Chapter 2. A Whisper Through Time. The folded note burned in Claire's pocket as she walked home. The words haunted her, looping through her thoughts like a melody she couldn't shake. Some stories begin with an ending. What did it mean? Her apartment was a cluttered haven of sheet music, forgotten sketches, and the faint scent of lavender. She placed her violin on its stand, unfolded the note again, and stared at it as if the answer might appear if she looked hard enough. Theo's words had stirred something in her, a mix of curiosity, unease, and something deeper she couldn't name. Determined to distract herself, Claire opened her violin case and took out her instrument. The strings sang under her fingers, filling the room with a bittersweet tune. Yet even the music felt heavy tonight, as though the air itself carried the weight of a secret. The next morning, she returned to Café Reverie, hoping to find Theo. But the hours passed, and he never appeared. "Looking for someone?" asked Lucy, the barista. "Did you see the guy from last night?" Claire asked. "Tall, dark hair, glasses?" Lucy frowned. "I didn't notice anyone like that. Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" Claire shook her head, her frustration mounting. How could someone so vivid disappear so completely? Determined to find answers, Claire decided to revisit the alley. The mural of the girl and the lantern was there, as vivid as she remembered, but something about it had changed. The lantern, which had been painted as though floating upward, was now tethered to the girl's hand by a string, and beneath the mural, in small looping letters, were the words, "Don't let go." Claire's heart raced. She was certain the mural hadn't looked like this the night before. Was Theo behind it? "Beautiful, isn't it?" came a voice behind her. Claire turned to see an elderly woman bundled in a knit shawl, her eyes bright with curiosity. "You know this mural?" Claire asked. The woman nodded. "It's been here for years, though it changes now and then, always when someone new comes to town." Claire frowned. "Someone new?" The woman smiled enigmatically. "You'll see." Feeling more confused than ever, Claire thanked the woman and walked away. But as she turned the corner, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Meet me at the rooftop of Hotel Orpheus. Midnight." The name sent a shiver down her spine. The Hotel Orpheus was an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city, rumored to be haunted. No one had been inside for years, and yet she couldn't ignore the pull of the message. At midnight, Claire stood outside the crumbling facade of the hotel. The city was eerily silent, the rain having stopped hours ago. The air smelled of damp stone and decay. Steeling herself, she pushed open the rusted doors. The lobby was a ghost of its former self. Cracked marble floors, chandeliers hanging askew, and the faintest echo of past grandeur. Her footsteps reverberated as she climbed the winding staircase, her heart pounding with every step. When she reached the rooftop, the city spread out before her like a tapestry of lights. And there, leaning against the railing, was Theo. "You came," he said, his voice soft. "What is this?" Claire demanded. "Who are you?" Theo turned to face her, and in the moonlight he looked different. Older, perhaps. Worn. "I told you," he said. "Some stories begin with an ending." "What does that even mean?" Theo sighed, pulling the leather notebook from his pocket. He flipped it open, revealing page after page of sketches and notes. Claire gasped when she saw the drawings. They were of her. "But how?" she whispered. "I've been here before, Claire," Theo said, his voice trembling. "I've met you before, and every time it ends the same way." Claire stepped back, her mind reeling. "What are you talking about?" "I don't belong here," he admitted. "I'm caught. Between times, between lives. And you're the only constant, the only thread I can hold on to." "This is insane," Claire said, though part of her wanted to believe him. Theo stepped closer, his expression pleading. "I don't expect you to understand, but you have to trust me. The mural, the note, the messages, they're all pieces of something bigger, something I'm trying to fix." Claire's heart ached with questions she couldn't form. She wanted to demand answers, to run away, to stay. Before she could decide, Theo reached into his pocket and handed her a small object. It was a silver key. "Keep this safe," he said, "and whatever happens, don't come looking for me." "But I'll find you," Theo interrupted. "I always do." And then, as the city clock struck midnight, he disappeared. Not into the shadows or down the stairs. He simply vanished, as though the night itself had swallowed him whole. Claire stood there, the key cold in her hand, and realized that her life would never be the same. Chapter 3. The Puzzle of the Past. Claire didn't remember how she made it back to her apartment. The night blurred into a haze of questions and disbelief, and when she finally collapsed onto her bed, sleep refused to come. The silver key rested on her nightstand, catching the faint glow of the streetlights outside. She picked it up, turning it over in her hand. It was unremarkable, small, tarnished, with no engravings or markings, yet it felt heavy, as if it carried a significance far greater than its size. The next day, Claire woke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly. She groggily picked it up, expecting a message from Lucy or a reminder about her lessons, but instead she found a new text from the same unknown number. "Find the box it opens. The answers are waiting." She stared at the message, her pulse quickening. Who was sending these? Theo? Or someone else entirely? Claire spent the day in a fog, replaying every moment she had spent with Theo. The mural, the note, the rooftop, all of it felt surreal, like a dream she couldn't wake up from. But the key in her pocket was real enough. As evening fell, she decided to start her search where the strange journey had begun. Café Reverie. The cafe was bustling, a stark contrast to the quiet night she had last been there. Lucy greeted her with a cheerful wave. "You're back? Let me guess, another latte?" Claire smiled weakly. "Sure." She found a seat near the corner where she had first met Theo. The table looked the same, down to the faint ring left by someone's forgotten coffee cup. Her thoughts were interrupted by a man clearing his throat. "Excuse me, miss," he said. "Is this seat taken?" Claire looked up to see an older man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes. He carried a briefcase, and his tailored coat suggested a life of order and precision. "No, go ahead," she said, distracted. He sat down, placing his briefcase carefully on the floor. As he settled in, Claire noticed something peculiar. The clasp on his briefcase bore the same tarnished metal and design as the key in her pocket. Her breath caught. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man blinked in surprise. "This? It's just an old case. Belonged to my grandfather." "Does it open with a key?" He tilted his head, curious. "Yes, but I haven't had the key in years." "Why do you ask?" Without thinking, Claire pulled the key from her pocket and held it out. The man's eyes widened as he reached for it, his hand trembling slightly. "This can't be," he whispered. "Where did you find it?" "A friend gave it to me," Claire said carefully. "Do you know what it opens?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he inserted the key into the briefcase. The lock clicked open with a satisfying sound, and he lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of faded photographs, letters, and a small, intricately carved wooden box. The man removed the box and placed it on the table between them. "This belonged to my grandfather," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He was an inventor, a dreamer. He used to tell me stories about other times, other places. I always thought they were just fantasies." Claire's heart raced as the man opened the wooden box. Inside was a pocket watch, its face cracked but still faintly ticking. Alongside it was a folded piece of parchment covered in elegant looping handwriting. She recognized the script immediately. It was Theo's. The man unfolded the parchment and began to read aloud. "To whoever finds this, if you've come this far, you've already begun to see the threads that connect us. The watch is more than it seems. It is a bridge, a tether to what was and what could be. Use it wisely, for the past has a way of finding us when we least expect it." He paused, his hands shaking. "This doesn't make sense. My grandfather couldn't have written this. It's not his handwriting." Claire leaned closer, her eyes fixed on the watch. Something about it drew her in. The hands moved irregularly, as if caught between seconds. "What does it do?" she asked. The man shook his head. "I don't know. I never even knew this box existed." Claire reached for the watch, her fingers brushing against its cool surface. The moment she touched it, a strange sensation washed over her. A pull, like gravity, but deeper, stronger. The cafe around her seemed to blur, the chatter fading into silence. She blinked, and when her vision cleared, she was no longer in the cafe. Claire found herself standing in the same alley as before, but the mural was gone. The walls were bare, the cobblestones pristine. The air smelled different, cleaner, sharper. A voice called out behind her. "Claire?" She turned to see Theo, but not as she remembered him. He was younger, his hair unkempt, and his glasses missing. He looked at her with the same mixture of recognition and sadness she had seen before. "You weren't supposed to follow me," he said softly. "I didn't mean to," she replied. "I touched the watch, and—" Theo sighed, running a hand through his hair. "The watch is a conduit. It doesn't just move through time, it finds people who are meant to change it." "What does that mean?" Claire asked. "It means," Theo said, stepping closer, "that you've just rewritten everything." Chapter 4. The Echo of Choices. Claire stared at Theo, the weight of his words sinking in. The alley was eerily quiet, as though the city had paused to listen to their conversation. "What do you mean I've rewritten everything?" she asked, her voice trembling. Theo ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "The watch wasn't meant for you. It's tied to me, to the choices I've made. You touching it, well, it's complicated." "Try me," Claire said, crossing her arms. Theo hesitated, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "The watch doesn't just move through time. It links pivotal moments. Moments where the world can shift, for better or worse. It's supposed to help me fix things, but it's finicky. Now that you've interacted with it, the timeline is unstable." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. "Unstable how?" Theo sighed. "It's hard to explain. Time isn't a straight line. It's more like," he gestured vaguely, "a thread in a tapestry. Pull one thread too hard, and the whole thing starts to unravel." Claire shook her head, her mind spinning. "So what now? Do we just fix it?" "It's not that simple," Theo said. "Every time the watch is used, it creates echoes, alternate paths, versions of reality that shouldn't exist. The more it's used, the harder it gets to keep track of what's real." "So what do we do?" Theo hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. Claire recognized it as the same one from the wooden box, though this version seemed older, its edges frayed. "We start here," he said, handing it to her. Claire unfolded the parchment, her heart racing as she read. "At the edge of the city, where the past meets the present, lies the key to what was lost. Follow the lantern's light, but beware. The echoes will try to stop you." "What does this mean?" Claire asked. "It's a riddle," Theo said, glancing around nervously. "The watch always leaves clues, but they're never straightforward. We need to find the place it's talking about." "The edge of the city," Claire murmured, her thoughts racing. "Where the past meets the present. That could mean the old port." Theo nodded. "That's what I'm thinking. But we need to move fast." "Why?" "Because the echoes will already know we're here," he said grimly. Before Claire could ask what he meant, a shadow moved at the far end of the alley. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but then it grew darker, more distinct. A figure emerged, its features obscured by a shimmering haze. Claire's breath caught. "What is that?" "An echo," Theo said, his voice low. "A fragment of a timeline that shouldn't exist. It's here to stop us." The figure stepped closer, and Claire could make out faint details. Its face was oddly familiar, almost like looking into a distorted mirror. "What does it want?" she whispered. "To correct the timeline," Theo said, grabbing her hand. "But trust me, its version of correction isn't what you'd want." The echo moved faster now, its form flickering like a flame. Theo pulled Claire toward the alley's exit, their footsteps echoing against the cobblestones. As they ran, Claire glanced back. The echo was gaining on them, its movements unnaturally fluid. "We can't outrun it forever," she shouted. "We don't have to," Theo said, skidding to a stop as they reached the main street. "Hold on to me." "What?" "Just do it." Claire grabbed his arm, and Theo reached into his pocket, pulling out the watch. He pressed a hidden latch on its side, and the air around them seemed to ripple. The world tilted, the streetlights blurring into streaks of gold. Claire felt as though she were falling and floating all at once. When the sensation stopped, they were no longer in the alley. Instead, they stood at the edge of the old port. The city skyline glimmered in the distance, and the faint sound of water lapping against the docks filled the air. Claire staggered, catching her breath. "What just happened?" "I used the watch to move us," Theo said, tucking it back into his pocket. "But we can't keep doing that. It's dangerous." "More dangerous than whatever that was?" Claire asked, glancing nervously around. Theo didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward a lamppost near the edge of the docks. A single lantern hung from it, its light flickering despite the still air. "That's it," he said. "The lantern." They approached cautiously, the lantern's light casting strange shadows on the worn planks of the dock. Beneath the lamppost was an old chest, its surface covered in barnacles and rust. Theo knelt beside it, his hands trembling as he inserted the key. The lock clicked, and the lid creaked open. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal. Theo picked it up, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" Claire asked. Theo opened the journal, flipping through its pages. Each one was filled with handwritten notes, sketches, and strange symbols. "It's a map," he said finally. "A map of all the echoes." Claire leaned closer, her eyes scanning the intricate lines and annotations. What does it lead to? Theo closed the journal, his jaw set. To the beginning, to the moment everything went wrong. Chapter 5. The Moment Everything Changed. The weight of Theo's words hung heavy in the air. Claire's mind spun with questions, but the urgency in his expression left no room for doubt. What happens when we find the beginning? She asked, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her. Theo hesitated. We fix it, or we destroy everything trying. Claire swallowed hard. No pressure, then. Theo allowed a wry smile, but it faded quickly. He pointed to a symbol on the map, a circular spiral with jagged edges. This is the anomaly. It's the point where the timeline fractured. If we can close it, the echoes will disappear, and the watch's tether to this mess will break. And if we can't? Theo didn't answer. The journal contained a set of coordinates and cryptic instructions. Theo's fingers traced the map as if memorizing every line. Finally, he snapped it shut and looked at Claire. We need to go back, further than I've ever gone before. How far? Claire asked, her voice barely a whisper. To the day I created the watch. The next few hours passed in a blur. Claire followed Theo's lead, trusting his certainty even as fear gripped her. They used the watch sparingly, leaping through fragments of time and space, each jump leaving Claire more disoriented. Eventually they arrived at a place that felt suspended in time. It was neither day nor night, and the air shimmered with an otherworldly hue. They stood in a vast field, where an old workshop sat isolated amid wildflowers. This is it, Theo said. The day I made the biggest mistake of my life. Claire followed him inside. The workshop was cluttered with tools, blueprints, and unfinished projects. At the center of the room was a younger version of Theo, hunched over a workbench. He was meticulously assembling the watch, his movements precise and deliberate. Is that you? Claire asked, her voice hushed. Theo nodded. I thought I was creating something that could help people, a device that could preserve memories, hold on to moments forever. But I underestimated how powerful it was. The watch became more than I intended. It began to manipulate time itself, and I couldn't control it. Claire approached the younger Theo cautiously. What happens now? Do we stop him? Theo shook his head. We can't. The timeline is too fragile. If we interfere directly, we risk collapsing everything. But there's another way. He opened the journal, flipping to a page marked with a symbol Claire recognized, the same spiral from the map. There's a failsafe, Theo explained. I built it into the watch, though I never had the courage to activate it. If we trigger it, the watch will reset time to its original state, erasing all the echoes. That doesn't sound so bad, Claire said. Theo's expression darkened. It comes at a cost. The reset will erase everything tied to the watch, including me. Claire froze, the weight of his words hitting her like a blow. What do you mean? You'll disappear? Theo nodded. I exist because of the watch. Without it, I'm just another echo. No, Claire said firmly. There has to be another way. We can fix this without losing you. Theo placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady. This was always my responsibility, Claire. I've lived through countless timelines trying to make this right. Meeting you, that wasn't supposed to happen. But it did, and I'm grateful for it. Claire felt tears prick her eyes. I don't want to lose you. You won't, Theo said softly. Not really. The timeline will heal, and you'll live your life as it was meant to be. You'll be free of all this. Before Claire could protest, Theo moved to the younger version of himself, careful not to disturb the scene. He reached for the watch on the workbench, his hands steady as he pressed a hidden latch on its side. The room began to tremble, the air crackling with energy. Claire watched as the younger Theo froze in place, the world around them unraveling like threads pulled from a tapestry. Theo turned to Claire one last time. Thank you, he said, his voice barely audible over the rising hum, for showing me what it means to truly live, even if just for a moment. And then he was gone. Claire woke up in her apartment, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. Her violin sat on its stand, the faint scent of lavender filling the air. For a moment she thought it had all been a dream. But when she reached for her nightstand, her fingers brushed against something cold, the silver key. Her heart skipped a beat as she held it in her hand, its weight familiar and comforting. Though she couldn't explain how or why, She knew that somewhere, in some way, Theo's presence lingered. And as she played her violin that morning, the melody carried a bittersweet note, an echo of a love that transcended time. Chapter 1. A Glimpse Through the Rain. The rain fell in fine, silvery threads over the cobblestone streets of Edinburgh, wrapping the city in a shimmering mist. Lights from old-fashioned lampposts cast golden pools of light, flickering against the rhythm of the drizzle. On any other evening, Zoe Ross would have relished the serenity of the rain, her notebook propped open on a cafe table, the scent of fresh espresso mingling with the petrichor. But tonight, she was late. "Sorry, excuse me," she called, weaving through the narrow alleys of Old Town, her umbrella awkwardly bumping into passers-by. She had spent too long at her gallery opening, lingering over conversations with curious patrons. The thought of anyone admiring her photography, her messy, spontaneous snapshots of strangers' lives, still felt surreal. She rounded the corner and nearly collided with a man who had stopped abruptly in the middle of the pavement. He turned, startled, his dark eyes locking with hers for a beat longer than polite. "Sorry, I wasn't looking," she said breathlessly. "It's all right," he replied, his voice calm, rich, and edged with an accent she couldn't quite place. He wore a gray coat, buttoned neatly, and clutched a leather-bound journal in his hand. Zoe noticed a stray raindrop clinging to his thick, tousled hair. Without another word, the man stepped aside, allowing her to continue. She nodded quickly and hurried on, her heartbeat inexplicably quickened. The cafe, Aster and Ivy, was warm and humming with life when Zoe finally arrived. Strings of fairy lights crisscrossed the ceiling, reflecting off vintage mirrors and the polished surface of mismatched tables. She spotted her best friend Lily at a corner booth, already halfway through her chai latte. "You're late," Lily teased as Zoe flopped into the seat opposite her. "Don't even start," Zoe groaned, shaking water from her umbrella. "It's like every street in this city is conspiring to delay me." Lily smirked. "Blame the streets all you want. What's more important is this." She slid a small envelope across the table. "Guess who's been nominated for the Scottish Art Collective's Rising Star Award?" Zoe stared at the envelope, her fingers hesitant to open it. Her heart was already racing. Being nominated was the kind of recognition she'd only dreamed of. "It's me, isn't it?" she asked jokingly, though her voice betrayed her nervousness. "Well, it's not me," Lily said, laughing. "Open it." Before Zoe could process her emotions, the cafe door jingled as someone entered. A sudden gust of cold air swept through, making her shiver. She glanced instinctively toward the door, and there he was. The man from the street. He didn't notice her. Instead, he approached the counter, exchanged a few words with the barista, and settled at a table near the window. Zoe watched him, her curiosity inexplicably piqued. "Earth to Zoe," Lily said, waving a hand in front of her face. "What's up?" "That guy," Zoe murmured, nodding toward the man. "I bumped into him on the way here. He's odd." Lily followed her gaze. "Odd? He's gorgeous. Go talk to him." "What? No, that's not." Zoe shook her head. "I don't even know why I'm thinking about him." Lily grinned knowingly. "Because fate works in mysterious ways. You should at least say hi." Zoe rolled her eyes but couldn't deny that she was intrigued. Something about him felt familiar, as though she'd seen him somewhere before. After a long moment of indecision, she stood. The man looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. Up close, she noticed a faint scar just below his left cheekbone, a detail that only made him more intriguing. "Hi," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "This is going to sound strange, but I think I saw you earlier. On High Street." He studied her for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You did. And now you're here." Zoe blinked. "Right. Small world, I guess." "Or perhaps not so small," he said cryptically. His voice carried the same calm confidence as before, but now there was something else, a strange familiarity. He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Would you care to join me?" Zoe hesitated for only a second before sitting down. "I'm Zoe, by the way." "Raphael," he replied, extending a hand. His touch was warm despite the cold rain outside. They talked for what felt like minutes but must have been hours. Raphael's stories were mesmerizing, of travels to far-off places, of strange encounters and coincidences that seemed too perfect to be chance. Zoe shared her own tales, of her passion for photography, her love for capturing fleeting moments. As the night deepened, the cafe emptied. Zoe realized she had forgotten about Lily, who had quietly slipped out at some point, leaving her a knowing text. "Good luck, you're welcome." When Zoe finally glanced at the time, she gasped. "I have to go. I didn't realize it was this late." Raphael nodded, rising as she did. "It was good to meet you, Zoe." "You too," she said, unsure why she felt a pang of reluctance to leave. They stepped outside together, the rain now reduced to a light drizzle. Zoe turned to say goodbye, but stopped. Raphael's expression had changed. His easy smile was gone, replaced by something she couldn't place, something almost mournful. "I should tell you something," he began, his voice softer now. Before he could continue, a figure appeared from the shadows, a man in a dark coat, his face partially obscured. He called Raphael's name, his tone sharp, commanding. Raphael stiffened. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, turning back to Zoe. "I didn't mean to." "What's going on?" Zoe asked, her pulse quickening. The man in the shadows stepped closer. "It's time," he said firmly. "You've been here long enough." "Wait," Zoe began, but before she could say more, Raphael stepped back, his expression pained. "Zoe, remember this. Not everything is as it seems," he said. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the mist. Zoe stood frozen, her mind racing. Something told her this wasn't the last time she'd see Raphael, or the last time her world would be turned upside down. Chapter 2. Unseen Paths. The next few days passed in a blur for Zoe. She couldn't shake the memory of Raphael, his voice, the sadness in his eyes. What had he meant when he said, "Not everything is as it seems"? What was it that felt so unfinished? At night, she replayed the brief encounter in her mind over and over, piecing together each moment. She had never felt so drawn to someone, so connected, and yet he had left her with nothing but questions. She had nearly forgotten about the strange man who had called Raphael away. In her confusion, Zoe buried herself in her work, focusing on her photography and the Rising Star Award nomination. Still, it was impossible to ignore the nagging pull at her chest, a quiet whisper that something wasn't quite right. That evening, as she stood at her kitchen counter, stirring a cup of tea, her phone buzzed. She glanced down, expecting a message from Lily, but it was a number she didn't recognize. "I need to see you again." It was signed simply, R. Her heart skipped a beat. There was no mistaking who the message was from. But how had he found her? What did he want? Without thinking, she typed back. "Where?" A few moments later, a location pinged on her map, a small, unmarked street just outside the city center. Zoe felt a chill creep down her spine. It was strange, unsettling even, but she couldn't ignore it. The night was cold and the streets unusually quiet as Zoe walked toward the location. The map led her to an old building, its stone exterior weathered with age, the windows darkened. There was no sign, no indication of what this place was. She hesitated at the entrance, her breath misting in the air. Just as she was about to turn away, the door creaked open. "Zoe," Raphael's voice echoed from the shadows. "You came." She stepped inside, the heavy door closing behind her with a soft thud. The interior was dimly lit, with only a few hanging lights casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The place smelled of old wood, incense, and something else. Something strange and faintly metallic. "What is this place?" Zoe asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound calm. "It's a place for people who need to understand things," Raphael replied, his voice low. He stepped into the light, his features sharper in the illumination. His eyes seemed different, darker. But there was no trace of the warmth that had been there the other night. Zoe felt a shiver of unease. "I don't understand. Why did you ask me here?" He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Because you're important, Zoe, more than you know." She looked at him, her confusion growing. "What do you mean? We just met." "I don't even." "You'll see soon enough." Raphael's voice was almost gentle, but there was an intensity in his eyes that unsettled her. "I'm not who you think I am, and neither are you." Zoe's heart pounded in her chest. "What are you talking about? I don't even know you." Raphael stepped back, taking a deep breath. "Maybe that's true, but I know you're connected to something bigger, something out of place." Zoe blinked, a sudden thought striking her. "Are you saying I'm in danger?" "No," he said firmly, "not yet. But you will be, if you don't understand what's happening." Before Zoe could ask anything else, the room grew even darker, the air growing thicker as if it were closing in on her. Then, from the far corner, a soft, mechanical hum began. Zoe turned quickly, her eyes wide with alarm. A large metal door had slid open, revealing a strange glowing machine. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Raphael didn't answer at first. Instead, he walked toward the machine, his back turned to her. "It's time for you to see. Time for you to understand." Zoe hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to leave, to run as far away from this strange place as possible. But her legs felt like they were frozen in place, as though some unseen force was holding her here. "Zoe, come here." Raphael's voice was soft, but it held an undeniable pull. She stepped forward, her feet moving of their own accord, as if she had no choice. When she reached the machine, she saw that it was surrounded by strange symbols, etched into the walls, glowing faintly in the darkness. The machine itself looked ancient, yet advanced, as if it were from another time, or perhaps another world entirely. "You're going to see something," Raphael said, his voice filled with anticipation. "Something that will explain everything. But be warned, once you know, there's no turning back." Zoe stared at him, a strange sense of foreboding washing over her. "What are you going to do to me?" "Nothing," Raphael replied, his eyes intense. "I'm not going to do anything. You're the one who's going to do it." She didn't understand, but she couldn't stop herself from stepping closer to the machine. As she reached out to touch it, a sudden flash of light engulfed her, blinding her to everything else. When Zoe opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the strange, dimly lit room. She was standing in the middle of a bustling street. The sounds of the city, the honking of cars, the chatter of people, were gone. Instead, she was surrounded by people who seemed oddly familiar. They weren't real, not in the way people should be. They were like echoes or fragments of memories, flickering in and out of existence. And then it hit her. The realization that hit her like a slap to the face. She wasn't in Edinburgh anymore. She wasn't even in her own world. The city around her was an illusion, a construct. Raphael had shown her the truth, and it was nothing like what she had ever imagined. And then she heard it. The sound of Raphael's voice, distant but unmistakable. "Welcome to the real world, Zoe. It's not what you thought it was." The world around her spun, and she realized her life had never been real. It had all been a simulation, a constructed reality designed for something or someone else. And she wasn't who she thought she was, either. Chapter 3: The Fabric of Reality. Zoe's heart hammered in her chest as she stood in the midst of the illusionary city. The streets were too perfect, too organized, like a dream she couldn't wake from. Pedestrians moved about in a kind of stilted harmony, as though they were actors playing parts in a scene that had no audience. The colors were sharp, almost hyper-real, and the air felt unnaturally still. "Zoe," Raphael's voice came again, this time close, almost as if he were right next to her. She turned, but saw nothing. "You're not seeing it clearly. You never have." She blinked hard, trying to force herself to understand what was happening. "This isn't real. It can't be. Where am I?" "Right where you need to be," came the reply, a low, calm tone that made her shiver. "The question is, where were you before?" Her mind raced, trying to hold on to the pieces of the life she'd known, her studies, her gallery, her friends. Lily's face flashed in her mind, but it felt distant, like a memory she had just lost. "You've never been who you thought you were, Zoe," Raphael continued, his voice seeming to echo around her, as though coming from every direction at once. "This place, this world, it was always a simulation, a test, and you've been a part of it." She closed her eyes, shaking her head. "A test for what? For who?" "For what you can become," he said softly. "You were always meant for something greater. Something far beyond your understanding." Her breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about? What's happening to me, to all of this?" Before he could respond, the city began to blur around her. The buildings shimmered and distorted, warping like reflections on water. She took a step back, feeling a surge of panic. The very fabric of this place was coming undone, as though reality itself was unraveling before her eyes. And then, from the very air itself, shapes began to emerge, figures made of light and shadow, moving through the air like ephemeral ghosts. They circled her, a constant, swirling presence, their forms shifting and flickering with every heartbeat. "You're not seeing it yet," Raphael said, his voice filled with a mix of wonder and sorrow. "You have to open your mind, Zoe. Only then will you truly see the truth." I don't want this, she cried out, taking another step back. The figures seemed to react, their movements growing more chaotic, their forms becoming more tangible. They began to press in on her, their presence suffocating. I don't want to know any more, Zoe screamed, her voice trembling. Take me back. I want to go home. But then something inside her shifted. An impulse, a strange, undeniable force. She felt herself drawn forward, compelled to step into the center of the shifting shadows. She didn't know why, but she did. And as soon as she did, the figures froze. The world around her went still, silent. You're ready now, Raphael said, his voice no longer distant, but right behind her. She spun around, only to find him standing there, his expression calm but serious. His eyes, though, were filled with something more, something almost regretful. You've always been meant for something greater, Zoe, he repeated. You're not just a part of this simulation. You're the key. The key to what? Zoe demanded, her voice barely above a whisper, fear and confusion bubbling up inside her. What do you want from me? He reached out a hand, his gaze locking with hers. I need you to choose, Zoe. I need you to decide if you want to break free from this world. If you want to see the truth, to be free of this illusion, you have to choose to let go. Let go of everything you think you know. Zoe looked down at her hands, trembling. The world felt like it was splitting apart, like she was being torn between two realities, two lives. Could she leave everything behind? Could she really abandon the world she knew, the life she had built? And then, without warning, the figures around her began to speak. Not with words, but with visions. Glimpses of other places, other lives. She saw herself, no, someone who looked like her, standing on a rooftop in a city she had never been to, staring out at a sprawling landscape. Another image, a version of herself standing in a laboratory, her hands working on something she didn't understand, surrounded by people who seemed just as out of place as she was. The visions blurred into one another, each more fleeting than the last, like fleeting dreams of someone else's life. And then, a voice cut through the chaos, a voice that was not Raphael's, but eerily familiar. It was the voice of someone she had never met, but somehow knew intimately. You are the catalyst, Zoe. The question is, are you ready to face what you were always meant to be? Zoe closed her eyes tightly, trying to block out the images, the voices. She wanted to scream, to make it all stop, but she couldn't. There was no escape from this moment, no way to wake up from this nightmare. Raphael, she whispered, her voice breaking. What am I supposed to do? I don't know what to choose. He stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers. You've already chosen, he said softly. Now, the truth is in you. You always knew it. It's time for you to wake up. As his words hit her, everything around her shifted. The images, the figures, the city, they all vanished in an instant. And Zoe found herself standing in a vast, empty space, white, infinite, and silent. She was alone. There was no one here but her. She looked around, but there was no sky, no ground, only endless white. Raphael, she called out, but there was no answer. Instead, she felt something deep within her shift. The pieces of herself she had never understood, the fragments of her past, the glimpses of her other selves, all of it came crashing into her mind. And in that moment, Zoe realized the truth. She wasn't from this world. She wasn't even from this universe. She was the catalyst, the one who would open the door to everything. And she had just taken the first step. Chapter 4. The Door to Everything. Zoe stood in the infinite white space, her mind a storm of confusion and understanding. She could feel the weight of the truth pressing against her chest, suffocating her as much as it liberated her. She had been living in a lie, in a world that was never meant to be real. But now, in this strange, empty void, she felt something stirring within her, a power, a purpose that she had never known before. It was as though every choice she had ever made, every step she had taken, had led her to this point. But it wasn't just about her. No, it was bigger than that, much bigger. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet began to ripple like water disturbed by a stone. The white space shimmered, and a door appeared in front of her. A door made of pure light, the edges glowing softly, pulsing as though it were alive. It beckoned her, drawing her in with an unspoken promise. Zoe felt her heart race as she moved toward it, every instinct telling her to turn away. But something deeper inside urged her forward. She had no choice. she had already chosen. Her hand reached out, trembling, and as her fingers brushed the surface of the door, it seemed to open of its own accord. The light surged forward, engulfing her in a brilliant flash. When the light receded, Zoe found herself standing on the edge of a vast, unfamiliar landscape. The sky above was a swirling canvas of colors, a mix of deep purples, fiery oranges, and shimmering blues that blended into one another, like the paint on an artist's canvas. The air was thick with the scent of salt and earth, a stark contrast to the sterile, white void she had just left behind. Before her lay an endless stretch of land, rolling hills that seemed to stretch on forever. Towering trees with iridescent leaves stood like sentinels, their branches reaching high into the sky. The ground beneath her feet was soft and warm, like walking on the sands of a distant shore. "This place," she whispered, her voice echoing in the stillness. "This is the real world," came Raphael's voice, and she turned to find him standing behind her, his face solemn, but his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "The real world?" Zoe echoed. "But I thought I was already in the real world. I thought." "No," Raphael interrupted gently. "You were never in the real world. You were in a simulation, a fabricated reality. Everything you knew, your life, your memories, was part of a test, a trial to see if you could break free." Zoe shook her head in disbelief. "A test? A test? But for what? For who?" Raphael's gaze softened. "For the future, for everything. You are the key, Zoe. You were always meant to open the door to this world, to unlock the truth." Zoe felt a chill run down her spine. "Unlock the truth?" she asked. "What truth? What do you mean?" "You're not just a part of this world," Raphael said, his voice lowering. "You're part of something much larger, something that exists beyond the boundaries of this universe." Zoe looked at him, her mind racing. Something larger? What does that even mean? Raphael stepped closer, his presence steady and calm in the face of the storm of questions that Zoe was struggling to process. "You've always known, Zoe. Deep down, you've always felt there was something more. Something out of place. That's because there is. This world, this universe, it's just one of many. The truth is, there are infinite realities, infinite worlds. And you, Zoe, you have the power to move between them." Zoe's breath caught in her throat. "Move between them? You mean like dimensions? Parallel worlds?" Raphael nodded. "Exactly. You are the catalyst, the one who can bridge the gaps between these realities. You can see the threads that bind them all, and you can choose to weave them together, or tear them apart." "But why me?" Zoe asked, her voice trembling. "Why am I the one who can do this?" "Because you were always meant to," Raphael replied. "You've been living in a world that was never real, and now you have the chance to shape the future of everything. But it's not easy. There are forces that don't want this truth to be known. Forces that will stop at nothing to keep this world, and all the others, locked in their illusion." Zoe's mind spun. It was too much. She had lived an entire life in a world that wasn't real, and now she was being told that she could move between infinite dimensions? That she was the key to unlocking the truth for all of existence? "Are you saying I can change everything?" she asked, barely able to comprehend the enormity of the situation. Raphael's expression was grave. "Yes, but be careful, Zoe. The truth comes at a cost. For every choice you make, there are consequences. For every world you alter, something will be lost." Zoe took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the surreal landscape around her. She felt both small and vast, insignificant and powerful all at once. The weight of her choice was overwhelming. She wasn't just deciding her fate anymore, she was deciding the fate of countless worlds. "How do I even begin to understand all of this?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You don't have to understand everything right away," Raphael said. "You only need to understand one thing. You're not alone in this. I'm here. And there are others like me, people who've been waiting for you." "Others?" Zoe asked, her curiosity piqued. "Others who have crossed the boundaries of these worlds before you. People who have seen what you've seen, who have chosen to walk this path. You're not the first to face this responsibility." Zoe swallowed hard. "What happened to them?" Raphael's expression darkened. "Some of them failed, some of them succeeded. But the path you take will be yours alone, and you will face challenges they never could have imagined." The ground beneath Zoe's feet trembled, and the sky above flickered. The sense of unease that had been building in her chest flared into full-blown anxiety. She had already chosen to step through the door. There was no going back now, but the magnitude of what lay ahead, of the weight of her decisions, was crushing. "What's the first step?" Zoe asked, her voice steadying with determination. Raphael looked at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "The first step is to remember who you are." Zoe nodded, taking a deep breath. She didn't know what lay ahead. She didn't know what this world truly was or the consequences of her actions. But she was ready to face it. She had to be. There was no turning back now. The air shifted around her once more, the land around her transforming as if it were folding in on itself. In the distance, the horizon began to glow, a faint line of light that beckoned her forward. It was a path, one that she was meant to follow. And with that, Zoe began her journey, stepping into the unknown, ready to embrace the truth that awaited her. Chapter 5. The Choice That Defines All. The land shifted beneath Zoe's feet as she walked toward the glowing horizon. The landscape was changing, bending with each step she took. The trees twisted and morphed into new shapes, flowers that shimmered like stars, rivers that shimmered in colors she had never seen before. It was as if the entire world around her was alive, shifting in tune with her movements, responding to her presence. But with each step, a heavy weight pressed against her chest. Raphael's words echoed in her mind, swirling like a storm she couldn't outrun. "You are the key. For every world you alter, something will be lost." The truth was now undeniable. She was not just a part of this world. She was a part of something much larger, a nexus of infinite realities. And the choices she made would ripple across every one of them. She didn't know how she was supposed to decide. How could anyone choose to unravel the fabric of so many lives, to tear apart worlds for the sake of one's own understanding? But the responsibility had already been placed in her hands. "Zoe," Raphael's voice cut through the stillness. He was behind her, his presence calming but steady. He had been quiet since their last conversation, watching as she walked through this ever-changing world, but now he stepped forward. She stopped, turning to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't know what to do," she confessed, her voice a whisper. "How can I choose? How do I know what's right?" "You already know, Zoe," Raphael said softly, his gaze unwavering. "You feel it in your heart. You know what's at stake. You just have to trust yourself." Zoe's eyes flickered to the horizon, where the glowing path continued to extend further into the distance. There was a sense of finality about it, a feeling that this was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that would define everything that came after. But there was one more thing that gnawed at her, one thing that she couldn't push away. "What happens to me?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. If I decide to change everything, to break the boundaries of these worlds, what happens to me?" Raphael's expression softened, and he took a step closer. "That is the hardest part. The truth is, you will change. Everything will change. And in the end, you may not recognize yourself. You may lose pieces of yourself, but you will never be the same." Zoe's throat tightened as she thought of the life she had lived, the memories she had forged. She had known those moments, those people, her friends, her family, her dreams, but they were part of a world that wasn't real. How could she leave it all behind? "I can't," Zoe whispered, stepping back. "I can't just erase everything." Raphael shook his head. "You're not erasing anything. You're evolving. You're unlocking the potential of all that you are, and all that you can become. There is no erasure, only transformation." Her breath hitched as she turned her gaze to the glowing path ahead. The weight of her choice pressed down on her like an immovable force. The truth was, she didn't know what she was going to lose, or if she could even handle the loss. She didn't know what would happen if she chose to step forward, if she chose to open the door to all the other worlds that beckoned her. But one thing was certain. She couldn't go back. "I can't go back," Zoe thought to herself. She was no longer that girl who had lived in a simulation, unaware of the greater truth. She had opened her eyes, and now she was standing at the precipice of something far greater than herself. With a deep breath, Zoe took the first step onto the glowing path. And the moment her foot touched the ground, the world shifted. The sky above crackled with energy, and the earth beneath her feet trembled as though it were awakening from a long slumber. The trees bent and twisted, their forms stretching into the horizon. The glowing path widened, its light brightening to an almost blinding intensity. And then, suddenly, everything froze. Zoe's heart raced in her chest as she looked around. The world had come to a standstill, as if she had stepped out of time itself. The air was thick with a palpable energy, and in the distance, she could see what appeared to be a door, a shimmering portal, pulsing with light. It was her door. The one that would lead her to the infinite possibilities of the worlds she could shape, the futures she could create. But it wasn't just a door. It was a decision. It was the choice to become everything she had ever dreamed of, or to become something beyond herself. Zoe knew what she had to do. She stepped forward, her hand outstretched. As her fingers brushed the surface of the door, she felt a surge of power unlike anything she had ever experienced. The energy coursed through her, enveloping her entire being. It wasn't just her mind that was expanding. It was her very essence, stretching into the infinite dimensions that lay before her. And then everything snapped into focus. The world she had left behind, her life, her memories, was still there, but it was now a distant part of who she was. It was no longer the center of her existence. She could feel the infinite possibilities of all the worlds that were now within her reach, each one a thread in the vast, interconnected web of reality. But Zoe was no longer afraid. She had become the catalyst, the key to all that could be, and all that would come. She was ready to embrace the truth, to reshape the world and everything in it. And as she stepped through the door, she knew that she was not alone. She was part of something greater, part of the infinite tapestry of existence. A tapestry that she would help weave, one choice at a time.